My dad gave a small smile and said, "Congrats, you're finally moving out." I nodded, handed him the house deed, and replied, "Best of luck handling next month's property taxes." As I packed my things, I couldn't help but grin. In just 10 days, a hidden clause would kick in. And the outcome? Well, thank you for spending time with me today. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Let me know in the comments which city or country you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's get into the story. The scent of aged wood mixed with my mom's usual baking, slightly burned, faintly sweet, used to be the first thing that hit me when I walked through the front door. It was meant to smell like home, but over the years, it began to feel more like responsibility. I was 28, a software developer with a hit app making waves, and yet I was still living in my childhood home. Not because I couldn't afford to leave, I easily could have moved out years ago, but because they said they needed me, or more accurately, because they made me believe they did. I wanted so badly to be the son they finally recognized and appreciated. Ever since I landed my first part-time job at 16, my income didn't belong solely to me. It became family money. The savings I had set aside for college went toward unexpected household expenses. My first real paycheck helped chip away at the mortgage, and any bonuses I received were quietly funneled into my dad's struggling small business. My younger brother, bless him, made it through college without a single student loan because I covered all of his tuition and living costs. They never asked, they just expected it. And I gave my money, my time, my energy, and endless emotional support. I was the one they called when something broke, when the bills piled up, or when they needed tech advice. I became the family's silent problem solver. But gratitude? That never came. Instead, I lived under a constant cloud of subtle dismissal. If I mentioned being exhausted, Mom would sigh and say, "We worked far harder for you when you were young." If I tried pointing out financial errors, Dad would brush me off. "It's your duty as a son. We gave you everything. Every sacrifice I made was never seen as kindness. It was treated as repayment for some undefined, overwhelming debt I supposedly owed just for existing." One memory still stings, maybe 5 years ago. I had just wired them a large sum I'd been carefully saving for a condo down payment. Mom had called, panicked about a medical emergency. Days later, I saw Facebook photos of her gleefully showing off a high-end handbag. When I gently brought up the medical costs, Dad cut in sharply. "Don't question your mother. That money helped us in a tough spot. You wouldn't understand." A familiar tightness gripped my chest. It wasn't just about the money. It was the ease of the lie, the complete disregard for the trust and effort I had given so freely. That moment planted the seed. That was when the small voice inside me, the one that had always yearned for their approval, began whispering, "Start protecting yourself." Not long after that incident, they came to me again, this time needing help refinancing the mortgage. The paperwork was dense, full of legal terms they didn't bother to read. They signed wherever I told them, eyes glazed over, focused only on the promise of lower monthly payments. Unbeknownst to them, after quietly consulting a lawyer, I had included a carefully crafted clause in the deed, a clause that stated if they ever tried to sell or transfer ownership without my explicit written approval, the full ownership would automatically revert to me after a specific date. It was a last resort safeguard, a desperate reaction to betrayal, something I hoped would never be triggered. I signed the documents with a mix of anxiety and grim satisfaction swirling in my gut. Deep down I wished they would change, that the clause would never matter. So I threw myself into my work, building my app with everything I had. It became my sanctuary, proof that I could create something real, something entirely mine. And when it finally launched, the response was electric. My phone lit up with notifications, tech blogs ran features about it, and investment offers started pouring in. It was thrilling, terrifying, and for once, something that belonged solely to me. But any sense of victory in that house never lasted long. My parents quickly shifted from barely acknowledging my interest in computers to suddenly becoming my most theatrical supporters. At family events, my dad would corner relatives, puffing out his chest and proudly declaring, "It was my guidance that shaped Daniel into the man he is today. We gave him the foundation he needed to thrive." Mom would nod in agreement, chiming in with, "We always believed in him, even when things were tough." My success stopped being mine. It was now a shining testament to their so-called stellar parenting. Every time they claimed credit, it felt like I was being erased, like they were cropping me out of the very story I had built. Just like when I was younger, if I ever dared to bring up my achievements, they'd subtly steer the conversation elsewhere. It was an old wound, but now it throbbed with a sharper pain, fed by a growing resentment. The energy in the house began to shift. Their demands didn't decrease, but the tone changed. There was a new, heavier entitlement. It was as if my accomplishments had become their property, their expanded resource pool. I started pulling away, spending more time holed, up in my room, working late into the night. The tension was suffocating, a thick fog that never lifted. They noticed the distance and mistook it for arrogance. That's when they decided to reassert control. It wasn't during a holiday or a serious sit-down. It was just another Tuesday evening. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen from a dinner I'd paid for when Dad called me into the living room. Mom was seated beside him, hands folded, her face stretched into what she likely thought was a supportive smile. "Daniel," Dad began, that same smug expression from the mortgage conversation tugging at his lips. "Your mother and I have been talking. You're doing so well now. You're independent." He paused, letting the words hang like a threat. My stomach turned. I knew what was coming. He leaned forward and picked up a stack of papers from the coffee table. The house deed. "So we think it's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet." He slid the deed across to me like a landlord evicting a problem tenant, not a father, talking to his son. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. Years of swallowing disappointment had taught me composure. I nodded slowly, picked up the deed, and held it in my hands. The paper felt thick, almost heavy, carrying with it every sacrifice I had made and the quiet plan I'd put in place. I met his gaze, not with fear, but with something he didn't quite recognize. Quiet resolve. "Thank you, Dad," I said softly, my voice calm. I looked down at the deed in my hands, then back at him. "Good luck with the property taxes next month." For a moment I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, quickly masked by his usual dismissiveness. He just nodded, probably expecting me to argue or plead. I didn't. I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving the symbolic weight of the house in his hands. As I made my way to my room to begin packing, a small, genuine smile crept onto my face. If they went through with their plan, the hidden clause would trigger in 10 days. The outcome was already set in motion. Packing felt oddly heavy and quiet. Every item I touched carried a memory, but the emotional weight had shifted. The smell of old wood no longer felt nostalgic. It smelled like confinement. The familiar worn rug didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like something I'd outgrown. I wasn't just packing up belongings. I was shedding a life that had become suffocating. Leaving that house didn't feel like walking away. It felt like stepping off a ledge. The silence in the small, temporary apartment I'd found was overwhelming, amplifying the emptiness that had quietly built inside me over the years. I had spent so long defining myself as the dependable son, the family's silent provider, that without that role, I felt hollow. There was pain, of course, sharp and raw from how easily they discarded me. After everything, this was how they saw me, disposable, and there was fear. What if the clause didn't hold? What if the plan fell apart? The calls and texts started, almost immediately after I moved my last box, not out of concern, not to ask if I was okay, but with demands. The first call from Mom was tearful and accusing. "How could you just leave like this? You've abandoned us." Then came Dad's messages, cold and commanding. "We need to talk about the house. Your brother's tuition is due next month." They still saw me as the family resource, just temporarily unavailable. But the panic didn't truly hit them until a few days later, when I received a storm of hastily typed error-filled texts from Dad, followed by a furious voicemail. "What did you do to the deed? The bank says there's a problem. We can't refinance." Then came the escalation. The accusations turned bitter, even venomous. My parents began contacting relatives and mutual friends, spinning a narrative of betrayal. "Daniel's trying to steal our house," they claimed. "He's gotten so greedy since he made money." Suddenly my phone was lighting up with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, filled with confusion and judgment. It was agonizing to hear their lies echoed back at me, to feel my character being shredded by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Each accusation felt like another wound, yet strangely, each one also steeled my resolve. The fear began to fade, replaced by a cold, focused determination. They weren't just after my time, energy, and money anymore. They were after my identity, my name. So I leaned on the people I knew I could trust. First, there was Mr. Harrison, my lawyer, an unshakable, calm man with years of experience in property law. I explained everything: the history, the clause, my reasons. He reviewed the paperwork, then looked at me with a firm expression. "Mr. Daniel," he said, "the clause is ironclad. You anticipated this long ago. Their attempt to sell or refinance without your consent triggered the provision. In 10 days, full ownership reverts to you. Legally, they're walking into a trap they didn't even know was there." His words felt like armor. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel crazy. I felt protected. Then there was Mike, a close friend I'd confided in. I told him everything: years of sacrifice, the gaslighting, the app, the eviction, the clause, the lies. He listened silently, and when I finished, feeling drained and exposed, he simply said, "Dude, that's messed up. You didn't break the family. They did. And you were smart enough to protect yourself. That's not greedy. That's survival." His words hit me hard, in a good way. He saw me for who I really was, not the selfish villain my parents were trying to portray. He was the first person, outside of a paid professional, to remind me that I wasn't wrong for choosing to save myself. His support became a beacon, proof that a healthier kind of family existed, one built on respect, not guilt. Meanwhile, my parents' tactics grew more frantic. Vague legal threats through email, anonymous calls that hung up the moment I answered, and cryptic social media posts about an ungrateful child. I ignored most of it, sending anything relevant to Mr. Harrison and staying focused on rebuilding my life. My apartment still felt empty, but my mind was clearer. The date Mr. Harrison had marked on the calendar drew closer, the day the clause would take effect. I knew they wouldn't let go without a fight, but neither would I. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in Mr. Harrison's office, a neutral space. They had requested it, likely hoping a formal setting would give them room to guilt-trip me, to pull me back into the web of manipulation. But I was ready. They thought I would crumble under the pressure. They were wrong. I arrived early, dressed simply in a shirt and slacks, calm but with a nervous energy humming beneath my skin. This wasn't just a legal dispute. It was the culmination of 28 years of wanting to be seen, of being used, and finally, of fighting back. Mr. Harrison, my lawyer, was there, his presence a quiet anchor of professionalism and legal clarity. My parents, on the other hand, arrived looking as though they were headed to church, not to a legal showdown. Dad wore a suit, his face carefully composed to show wounded dignity, while Mom wore a pastel dress, clutching a tissue, her eyes filled with what I knew were performative tears. They had brought my younger brother Mark along. He looked uncomfortable, caught between us, his eyes darting nervously. I suspected they'd brought him as moral support, or perhaps to use him as a prop, hoping his presence would make me hesitate. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with unspoken history and tension. We sat across from each other at the long table, my parents and Mark on one side, Mr. Harrison and I on the other. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Dad cleared his throat, beginning the performance. "Daniel," he started, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. "We are so heartbroken you've done this. This was our family home, everything we worked for." He launched into their well-rehearsed narrative, how I was ungrateful, how I betrayed them, all centered around the clause. Mom dabbed at her eyes, letting out quiet sniffles at the right moments. They twisted the events, painting me as a villain, driven by greed since my app became successful. "We only ever wanted what was best for you," Mom whispered, her voice trembling. It was the same line they'd used my whole life, their signature justification for every manipulation. I listened, my face neutral. I felt a dull ache, but not the sharp pain it once caused. Their words were just noise now, a worn-out record. When they finished, Mr. Harrison nodded politely at them, then turned to me. It was my turn. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice steady and calm, "I didn't do this to hurt you. I did this to protect myself. Because after years of giving, of sacrificing, and of watching you take credit and dismiss my contributions, I learned I couldn't rely on you to treat me fairly, especially not after." I paused, briefly referencing the past betrayal to tie it to the clause's origin. The weight of my words hung in the air. "And especially not now." I looked at Mr. Harrison. "Mr. Harrison, could you please present the evidence?" Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase, pulling out a few printed emails and documents. Mr. Harrison calmly placed the documents on the table, sliding copies across to my parents and Mark. "These," he stated, "are email communications between Mr. Daniel's parents and a real estate agent, dated 2 days after Mr. Daniel moved out. They detail the immediate listing of the property, requesting a rapid sale due to urgent financial needs." My parents stiffened, clearly not expecting this. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice steady and factual. "Further documentation includes a loan application denying them funds, citing significant debt that Mr. Daniel was apparently unaware of, and correspondence discussing using the entire proceeds from a swift sale of this house to cover their financial shortfalls and move into a smaller rental." The air in the room grew still. This wasn't just proof they were selling the house. It was proof of their immediate intent to cash out, leaving me with nothing. Dad's face turned red, and Mom gasped, dropping her tissue. "Those are private," Dad sputtered, reaching for the papers. Mr. Harrison calmly placed his hand over them, asserting that the evidence wasn't just confirmation of past behavior, but irrefutable proof of their current, selfish plan. It was the moment they thought. They had control of the house, and now it was exposed. Then the shockwave hit. Mark. He had been looking at the documents, his face pale, before he slowly raised his eyes to our parents. The horror in his gaze said everything. He knew I had supported him, that I'd helped with the mortgage, and seeing this cold, hard evidence of their plan, a plan that would have left me with nothing and potentially affected his own future support, shook him visibly. He didn't say anything, but he slowly pushed his chair back from our parents, his eyes meeting mine. In that brief exchange, I saw not accusation, but confusion and a flicker of understanding. He wasn't just an innocent bystander, he was an unexpected ally. As these documents show, Mr. Harrison continued, cutting through the tension, Mr. Daniel's parents attempted to sell the property immediately after requiring him to vacate without his consent. This action triggered the clause Mr. Daniel legally placed on the deed years ago to protect his investment against such a move. Mr. Harrison looked directly at my parents. As of today, the 10th day following your attempt to list the property, legal ownership automatically reverts entirely to Mr. Daniel. You no longer own it. You cannot sell it. You cannot borrow against it. And you are legally residing there only at Mr. Daniel's discretion. He placed a final document on the table, a copy of the updated deed, registered that morning. My parents' carefully constructed facade shattered. Dad exploded, shouting accusations and pounding the table. Mom openly sobbed now, not quiet tears, but loud, wrenching cries. They tried to argue with Mr. Harrison, but he calmly reiterated the legal facts. Their power over me was gone. Their plan had backfired spectacularly, leaving them exposed, defeated, and potentially facing the financial distress they tried to escape using my sacrifice. I sat there watching them. It wasn't sweet victory that I tasted, but the sharp, metallic tang of freedom bought at a terrible price. The knot I hadn't realized had been there for 28 years finally loosened in my chest. The immediate aftermath was messy, as expected. My parents didn't go quietly. There were more threats, calls to other family members, even a frivolous legal challenge that Mr. Harrison quickly shut down. But their leverage was gone. The house was legally mine. My first step was to have Mr. Harrison inform them they had a limited time to vacate. It felt harsh but necessary, not about revenge, but about setting a final, undeniable boundary. The house, a symbol of my pain and their control, needed to be free of that energy. They protested, pleaded, and threatened, but the legal reality was clear and unshakable. Dealing with the house was both emotionally and practically complex, but I eventually decided to sell it. Walking through it one last time, with the rooms stripped of their familiar clutter, felt like a final exorcism. The scent of old wood lingered, but it no longer felt like a cage. It was more like a museum of a life I was leaving behind. Signing the closing papers felt like cutting the last tie. It wasn't easy. There was grief for the family I had hoped, for the home it should have been. But there was also immense relief. The consequences for my parents were hard to watch. They had to sell their belongings and move into a smaller apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. They lost social standing among family and friends who had seen the truth, and some distanced themselves. While painful, it was the result of their own choices. My journey wasn't instantly blissful. Escaping the toxicity left scars. There were days I doubted myself or longed for the idealized family I once wished for. Therapy helped me process the trauma and rebuild my self-worth without depending on their validation. But I started building something new, something healthier. My friendship with Mike grew deeper, and he and his partner became my chosen family. We spent quiet evenings laughing, celebrating small victories, and supporting each other, no strings attached. I learned what unconditional support felt like: quiet, steady, and without hidden agendas. I also started forming new connections with people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. These relationships weren't built on blood or obligation, but mutual respect. Setting boundaries became an essential part of my life. Saying no without guilt, limiting contact with toxic individuals, and protecting my peace became acts of self-care. Reflecting on everything, the lessons are clear. Family isn't just defined by blood or shared addresses, but by love, respect, and genuine care. My worth isn't based on my ability to sacrifice for others, but on my intrinsic value. The truth, though painful, is the only path to real freedom. Healing is not a destination, but an ongoing process, committing to nurture the broken parts of yourself. I still feel a bittersweet ache, a lingering sadness for the relationship I mourned long before it officially ended, but mostly I feel peace. I now have my own space, both physically and emotionally. My finances are my own, managed for my future. My success is mine, celebrated by people who truly care. The house is gone, a chapter closed. But for the first time, my future feels like it truly belongs to me. Leaving the house was difficult, but leaving the toxicity was necessary. Have you ever had to draw a line with family? What does home truly mean to you?